Hi, welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm going to teach you how to crochet a granny square. A granny square is a classic square made using the granny stitch, and these can be pieced together to create a cardigan or a blanket or many different items. These squares specifically are used to create my Granny Square cardigan, which is available as a free pattern on my website, originallylovely.com. I will have that linked below. The yarn that I'm using for this pattern is Lion Brand Nubu, and I'm using 5 colors. I'm using 1 color per round, and white is going to be the final round on each square. The hook size that I'm using is a 4.5 millimeter crochet hook. This is smaller than the recommended hook size for this yarn, and when making granny squares, I actually do recommend to go down a hook size. So to begin, we're going to create a magic ring. So lay the yarn across your fingers, wrap it under and hold it with your pinky, wrap it over the front and cross it. Insert your hook under the first strand and pull up a loop with the second. Pull up a loop with the first strand again and pull it through that first loop. If you've never worked a magic ring and need a slower full tutorial, I have an entire tutorial dedicated to the magic ring linked below. Now that we have our ring created, we will chain 2 to begin our square. The chain 2 will count as the first stitch in this pattern. Now we will work 2 double crochets into the magic ring. So these 2 double crochets and the chain 2 will count as our first granny stitch cluster. So now we have to create a corner. So we'll chain 1, and now we work 3 double crochets into the ring once more. In this pattern, I'm only chaining 1 at the corners because this yarn is kind of silky and it does have a tendency to create bigger holes because of that. Generally, I would chain 2 at the corners, so just keep that in mind. So we're working our 3 double crochets. This is our second side of the granny square. After those 3 double crochets, we will chain 1. I tightened up my magic ring just a little bit because I think it's easier to work into when it's not super big. I didn't tighten it up all the way though, so I can still insert my hook. So chain 1, now I'm working 3 double crochets once more into the ring. This is creating the third side of my granny square. Each side will only have 1 stitch cluster to begin with, and then we will increase at each of the corners as we move forward. So now chain 1 at that third corner, work 3 more double crochet stitches to create that final side. And then we will chain 1 once more to work that final corner. So now we will join using a new color of yarn. I always work the final slip stitch join with the new color just because I think that it makes the transitions between colors look the most seamless. So taking your new strand of yarn, you can use whichever color you want. I used a very random order with my coloring for this cardigan and these granny squares. I just made sure not to put 2 colors that are too close to each other next to each other. So now I'm joining with a slip stitch. I'm just going in through the top loop of that first chain 2, the second chain of the chain 2. Just a slip stitch to join. And now we're going to be working this in rows, which creates a granny square that doesn't twist at all. So we're going to turn the piece and work back the opposite direction. So you can kind of see our corners developing and our granny clusters. So we have to turn it towards us and into, this is very important, into that corner piece at the bottom, we're going to work a slip stitch, that gap space at the corner, chain 1 gap. And now we have officially completely joined. So we can begin our second round. So now we will chain 2, which is our first stitch, and work 2 double crochets into that corner gap space. So we're increasing into each of the corners, and we're just working these 3 double crochet granny clusters into each gap space. So now, since our next gap space is a corner space, we'll go right into it and work 3 double crochets right into that corner. So it's just the chain 2 double crochets, and then 3 double crochets into the next corner space, our next gap space, which is a corner. So then, since we are at a corner, after these 3 double crochets, we will chain 1 and then work 3 more double crochets into that corner gap space. Once those are completed, we'll work into our next gap space, which is a corner again. So if it's hard for you to see at first, just look for the 3 double crochets, and then you know that the next stitch is the chain. It's a smaller gap on the first round. It's kind of hard to see, but it is there. So now work 3 double crochets into that gap corner space, and then chain 1 for your corner and 3 more double crochets. This is how our corners will be throughout the entire pattern. So each row or round, you have one more granny cluster than you had on the previous one. So on each side of the square, we only had 1 granny cluster to begin with, and now we have 2. So you can see our square is starting to form a little bit more prominently on this row. It doesn't quite look like just a circle. So now at that next corner, 3 double crochets, and then a chain 1 and 3 more double crochets. This yarn really makes a beautiful granny square. It has such beautiful stitch definition and is just the slightest bit silky, but it is a little bit splitty. So if you feel like you generally have problems with your yarn splitting on your hook, or that really bothers you, you might want to try a different yarn. All right, so we just finished that corner, and now we're up to this final corner. So we have to work 3 double crochets into this corner. We already have the first half of the corner worked, so we're just finishing the second half. So 3 double crochets, and then we'll chain 1 to make that final corner chain space. And now we will have to grab our new color to join. So you can kind of pull the spots. If it got a little tight where you switch the colors, you can pull those, or your center magic ring, you can pull that a little tighter. So now taking our new color, that's where we will slip stitch. So inserting into the second chain of the chain 2, which is considered our first stitch, we're just pulling up a loop with the new color and working a slip stitch. So pull up a loop and then pull through the first loop as well. And now once again, since we're working back and forth, turning each row, turn it towards us and work a slip stitch into that gap space just to finish joining. This just makes your corners look better and really keeps the increases in the corner. Some granny squares increase on the side. There's quite a few different ways to do them. Every crocheter kind of has their own preference. All right, so now to begin, we'll chain 2, that first stitch, and then 2 double crochets into that same gap space. So now we're working 3 granny clusters along this edge. So we have a space to work into here that's not a corner. So we'll work 3 double crochets into that gap space. It's not a gap space that's created by a chain at all. It's just where the 3 crochet stitch clusters are kind of pulled away from each other. It's really nice. Granny squares are it's great how you can work into the gap, not into stitches. It goes pretty quickly. So at this next corner, we'll work 3 double crochets once more, and then chain 1 to create that corner, and work 3 more double crochets. So again, if you're using yarn that's not quite this silky, you could chain 2 at the corners. I chain 1 with this yarn just because it is kind of a silky yarn, and the way that it doesn't really grip on itself, it makes bigger holes. So that is why I'm only chaining 1 at these corners. So now into that next gap space, we'll chain or work 3 double crochets again. So now on this third row, we have 3 double crochet clusters per side. So now at that next corner, 3 double crochets, chain 1 and 3 double crochet. I do have the written version of the written instructions for this pattern linked on my website as well, so if you would like to follow along with those. They are for my Granny Square Cardigan, but the squares are the same. The pattern is the same. So now I'm going to zoom ahead a little bit here because it gets a little repetitive. So we're just going to continue working 3 double crochet stitches into each of those gap spaces. And then our corners are worked the same as they have been up till this point. 3 double crochets, chain 1, 3 double crochet. That just increases at each of our corners. These do work pretty quickly. As I go along, I can get one of these done in about 10 minutes, so it is nice to have a quick project. I do highly recommend weaving in your ends as you go, just because it gets a little tedious at the end if you have to do them all at once per square, like as you finish a square. So on this final gap space, again, we're going to work 3 double crochets and then a chain 1. And then to join with that next round again, we will work a slip stitch in our new color. So we've worked 3 colors. Now this is our 4th color, 4th and final color before we'll do our final round in white. So taking our new strand of yarn, I like to hold it in my right hand as well, just so that it's a little bit easier to work with for the first couple stitches. So now again, slip stitch with the second chain of that chain 2, the first stitch to join with the new color. And then turn your work and slip stitch into that gap space to complete your join. And then we can begin this 4th round. So chain 2 and then 2 double crochets into that corner space. And then we'll continue working across the same as we've done, working 3 double crochets into each gap space. I'm going to zoom ahead just a little bit because it is quite repetitive and you're probably getting the idea. If you want to pause here and catch back up when you complete this round, now would be a good time to do so. So you can see we're at that next corner, chain 1 and then 3 double crochets again. So there are a lot of different techniques to join colors in granny squares, and some people do tie knots or just hold the yarn with them for a while, but I really do think that the most secure way is to weave in your ends, and anything else will kind of work its way out, especially when your yarn is silky and smooth as this yarn. It just doesn't really have any grip on itself. So now we're working our final 3 double crochet stitches, and then we will join with our final color, the white. So I'm working the end of each round, the final round of each square in white, so that when they're all connected, the white will kind of have a grid effect with all the different colors inside. It will look really nice and pretty. I'm going to snip my strands here just to kind of get them out of the way. Sometimes I wait until the end to cut them. Make sure you leave some tails to weave in. and then that slip stitch join once more with our final color into that second chain of the chain 2. And then turn your work and work a slip stitch into that corner space. Sometimes it does split. Like I said, this yarn can be a little bit splitty. I don't really mind it too much, but I know that some people get really bothered by that. So just keep that in mind if you're choosing this yarn or another yarn for this project. Work your 2 double crochets and then 3 double crochets in each of your gap spaces to the corner. I'm going to speed ahead here a little bit again. So on this final round at our corners, we are going to chain 2 instead of chain 1 at the corner spaces. This is because when we're seaming our granny squares together, it's easier to divide up the chain 2 spaces. So one of the chains will go towards one side when you seam it up, and one will go towards the other side. So working that final corner stitch here, we're working the 3 double crochets. And then again, like I said, instead of chaining 1, we're going to chain 2. So 3 double crochets, chain 2, and then work 3 more double crochets into that corner space. So this just makes it a little easier so that each row has the same, each side of your square has the same number of stitches to weave in and seam together with all the other squares. This makes it just a little bit more smooth, so you can see that there, how that those 2 chains will be divided. So now continue across, working 3 double crochets into each of the gap spaces. I'm going to zoom ahead just a little bit here again. And remember, just that final round, you're working 2 chain stitches at the corners instead of 1 chain stitch. That's really the only difference with this round. The reason that we've been turning and working our rounds not just all flat one direction, we turn at the end of each round, is because that prevents our granny square from kind of spiraling a little bit. That can be an issue. So this will keep our granny squares actually looking square and just a little bit more even looking. If you notice, sometimes they do kind of just have this like warp twisting look. So this prevents that. So in our final spot, we chain 2, and now we slip stitch to join with that first chain 2. Instead of just going into one of those loops, I'm actually slip stitching with both of those loops to join this final round, just so that it's a little bit more, it looks more similar. It's a little bit hard to get through both of those loops, but just take your time and you can do it. And then we will just, after we've done that final slip stitch, we'll just snip our yarn and then pull that final strand all the way through to complete. And now we have a handful of ends to weave in, which isn't too bad. I do recommend, like I said, doing those as we go. You can see how the square developed and how each row just has one more granny cluster. And once it's all, you can kind of see what it'll look like stretched out, like when it's blocked a little more. So continue on, make as many of these as your pattern calls for. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. Let me know if you have any questions, and be sure to like and subscribe this video if you want to see more of my work. Thanks, enjoy.